Why is Israel sitting on its butt as Iran and Hezbollah are poised to attack it? What do the hostage talks have to do with it? And what does the massive U.S. deployment of forces to the Middle East have to do with all of this? I'll give you the details. All the answers, of course, are connected. And I'll also talk about what they tell us about the difference between Kamala Harris's foreign policy and Donald Trump's. Coming up on In Focus. So, first of all, I'm glad to be back in Israel with the gang here at JNS. So that's good. And then a piece of bad news and a request from you before I start the show today. So our intrepid, heroic editor-in-chief, Jonathan Tobin, has taken ill, and we're all praying for him. And it would be great if you could spare some time in your prayers to pray for his quick and full return to health, refuah shlema, to Jonathan. His name for prayers is Yonatan ben Frida, Jonathan, son of Frida. So that's that. And we're all thinking about you, Jonathan, and we all are waiting for you to come back to work as quickly as possible in full health. And now to In Focus. Yes, I'm back in Israel after 5 weeks away. It feels like eternity, and it also feels like I never left. It's one of those things about being home, isn't it? So we find ourselves back in Israel at a time of increase of massive alert, highest alert for incoming Iranian and Hezbollah assaults, ground, missile, whatever, coming from all directions. The IDF is on high alert. And we've been sitting here sort of in this holding action since Israel whacked Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran and Hezbollah's terror chief Fuad Shukr in Beirut on July 30th. And since then, Hezbollah and Iran have been threatening to massively retaliate, and they haven't done anything so far. But the U.S. swept into action, doing a number of things. The first thing that the United States did was announce that it was deploying a bunch of additional forces to the region, and I just want to go through them because there are a lot of them. So they've sent over a dozen F-22 Raptors. They've sent over a dozen F-18s. They arrived at an airbase in the region. You have accelerating deployment of the aircraft carrier USS Lincoln, which was supposed to replace the USS Theodore Roosevelt that was supposed to be here on a temporary deployment. It's off the coast of Oman. But right now they're saying that the Roosevelt is going to stay here and the Lincoln is rushing to get here. They have the USS Georgia, which is an Ohio-class guided missile submarine armed with 150 Tomahawk cruise missiles. AV-8 Harrier fixed-wing warplanes are already in the Mediterranean, and they also have 4 Air Force fighter squadrons along with naval fighters. They brought in K-35 refuelers to the area for Marines, and more. And in answering questions at the Pentagon about what this deployment is supposed to mean, we had U.S. Air Force Major General Patrick Ryder came back with this explanation for the increased deployment of U.S. forces to the Mediterranean, to the Middle East, to the Persian Gulf. He said, we do not want to see this broaden into a wider regional conflict. And so those capabilities bring real capacity to the U.S. to support all of those objectives. And so whatever you want to interpret it as, whether it's messaging or providing additional capabilities, I think the answer is yes on all accounts, as it always has been. So I think that the most important sentence in that paragraph, which is a little bit turgid, is the issue that has been repeated by President Biden and by Vice President Kamala Harris over and over, is that we do not want to see this broaden into a wider regional conflict. So that is the purpose of the deployment of these U.S. naval and Marine and ground and Air Force assets to the region now to supplement the 30,000 troops that are already deployed in CENTCOM arena. And we have to ask ourselves, what exactly are they talking about? We've been in a regional war since October 7th when Israel was invaded, and then October 8th we were attacked and have been consistently attacked, continuously attacked since then by Hezbollah, by the Houthis in Yemen, by Iranian-controlled Iraqi militia operating in Iraq and in Syria, and, of course, by Palestinian forces in Judea and Samaria, and by Iran itself, which attacked Israel with 300 ballistic and cruise missiles and drones on April 13th. So this has been a regional war since the outset, and here's the United States saying we don't want it to widen into a regional war. So what are we supposed to make of that statement? And I think the answer here is quite clear, that the United States says that they're going to help Israel intercept whatever incoming projectiles. They're also going to be deploying more land-based interceptor missiles to help Israel intercept whatever missiles and drones, etc. Iran sends in this direction. They're not going to be that much help with Hezbollah, but Israel has its forces on the ground, and we'll just have to see what happens. And so what we're seeing again is a replay of April, where the United States assembled this coalition of forces that's job was to prevent Iran from causing any major damage against Israel. Israel actually did almost all of the interceptions on the night of April 13th, 14th, although the United States took all the credit for it. The United States only intercepted a fraction, and the vast majority of the projectiles were intercepted by Israel. All the same, the United States said, see, we have this great coalition that's intercepted all of these missiles. And then famously or infamously, President Biden said to Prime Minister Netanyahu, take the win, as in only one little Bedouin girl was killed on the night of April 13th, 14th. All major damage was avoided to Israeli military bases, to Israeli military assets, and to Israeli civilians that would have happened if the missiles hadn't been intercepted that night. And so Israel should take a win and not retaliate for Iran's massive missile assault against Israel. In other words, Iran was granted immunity from counter-assault, from retaliation against its own territory after it attacked Israel from its territory. The same is going on now with Lebanon. You have President Biden's envoy to Hezbollah, Amos Hochstein. I'm recording this on Wednesday, August 14th. Hochstein is back in Lebanon for the first time, I think, since June, he said. And he's trying to reach a ceasefire between Hezbollah and Israel. What would the ceasefire involve? It would involve Israel ceding its sovereign territory in the Golan Heights, Mount Dov, to Hezbollah, giving Hezbollah effective control over all of northern Israel, including the Gulf of Haifa, which is controlled as well by Mount Dov. And that's one of many Hezbollah demands for territory. And in exchange, Hezbollah would remove some of its forces in a way that's unenforceable, basically, or they would make an unenforceable commitment to remove their forces to around 10 kilometers from the border with Israel, even though its drones now have a longer range than that. Its low-flying anti-tank weapons have a longer trajectory or a longer range than that, so that Hezbollah really wouldn't be diminished, and Israel wouldn't take any offensive action against either Hezbollah's military bases, its missile bases, or its ground forces that are poised to invade Israel whenever they're giving an order to do so. So the United States wants Israel to take a win by intercepting missiles that are being shot in order to cause mass damage and mass casualties to Israeli civilians and to Israeli military assets from Lebanon, from Iran, most importantly, and not retaliate. That's the point. So all of these naval assets and Air Force assets, they're there on the one hand to defend Israel from the expected assault, but on the other hand to contain Israel and to prevent Israel from winning this war, from having Iran pay any strategic cost for their aggression against Israel, whether their direct aggression against Israel through whatever they want to throw at Israel, or their proxies' aggression against Israel, Hamas, the Houthis, the militia in Iraq, the militias in Syria, and, of course, Hezbollah and Lebanon, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that's what the United States is sending all of these assets to the Middle East in order to accomplish, which is quite amazing. And if you add to that the other thing that we're seeing, so the United States is sending these assets, as General Ryder said, we do not want to see this broaden into a wider regional conflict. So we don't want Israel to retaliate against whatever it is that they're going to be getting. That's the point. That's the point of the U.S. deployment here. It's to contain Israel first and foremost, to avoid any cost to Iran in Iranian territory. It's nuclear installations, it's missile installations, it's oil installations, it's gas installations. All of them are supposed to be immune from an Israeli counterattack, just as they were after the April 13th, 14th missile and drone attack that it carried out against Israel. Israel was blocked by the United States from carrying out any significant retaliation. Instead, all Israel did was a demonstration of capabilities in its counter-assault on Iran. That's all that we were able to achieve because of American pressure and extortion. And now comes back to the exact same play. Add to that play another play, which is a hostage talk. So what are the hostage talks involving? They're involving the same deal that President Biden presented in May as Israel's position, right? And Israel made clear that, in general, a lot of it was correct. Some of it was incorrect. And they went through and explained what, Israel's position was. So just very broadly speaking, because I don't, A, feel like getting into the details, and B, they're always shifting and changing depending on what Hamas's demands are at any particular moment. We'll get to that in a second. But the basic contours of the deal are that Hamas will give up at a ratio of 10 terrorists to 1 hostage, up to 30 hostages. There are 115 hostages in Gaza. About 40 of them are presumed to be dead. So 115 minus 40 is around 75 or so hostages that are presumed to be alive, right? And they'll give 40. They'll give 30, which means that another 40 are going to be left there behind. And so that's and that includes all of the young men. That may include the female hostages who are soldiers in the IDF, and a lot of other people, right, who are healthy males, for instance, who came in who are not in the army, the men who were taken hostage in the Nova festival, etc. They're not on the list because this is only humanitarian release, right? So up to 30, probably more like 20 hostages released alive in varying degrees of, health. And in exchange, Israel is supposed to end its operations in Gaza, at least for the duration, which would be up to 6 weeks, and begin removing its forces from Gaza. All right? And the idea here is to set up a dynamic in the first phase of what's supposed to be a multi-pronged thing where Israel, all of the pressure is placed on Israel not to reinstate its military operations at the end of phase 1. So that it's a trap, and it's an open trap. Everybody knows that. Everybody sees it, that the point here is to only get to stage 1 and leave all the rest of the hostages behind. Because if Israel removes its military forces in phase 1 from Gaza, whether from the Netzarim corridor that blocks terrorists from reseating in northern Gaza, or from the Philadelphia corridor, which is a new demand, meaning that their highway, their terror highway from Egypt is going to be reopened, and they'll be able to resupply. They'll be able to, among other things, take all the hostages that aren't released in the first stage, move them out of Gaza into a third country, wherever, and hide them forever away, prevent them from ever coming home. That's another thing that could happen. But that Israel cedes its control, its hard-fought control over the international border between Gaza and Egypt, right? And so that's another one of the demands, that Israel not re-engage in any military operations in Gaza, so that, first of all, it would be much more difficult. We would have to reconquer areas that we've already taken control over if we reinstate our military operations after the first phase. We lose all leverage to gaining the remaining hostages if we remove our forces. And we set up so that Hamas survives this war and is able to reconstitute its military forces and remains the regime in Gaza remains the uncontested regime of Gaza, right? So that Israel right now is poised on the verge of a strategic victory over Hamas, and the deal would turn that on its head and turn it into a strategic defeat. And that's the deal that the Biden administration is pushing for. And to this end, we see that all of the pressure now is on Israel. Here, I just went through a bunch of articles before I started filming today. So here we have Haaretz, U.S. and other mediators threaten to call out Israel, Hamas, if Gaza hostage talks fail. A diplomatic source told Haaretz that the Biden administration, which until now has solely blamed Hamas for the talks deadlock, is reaching the point where Prime Minister Netanyahu's behavior would result in the U.S. publicly accusing him of harming the talks and preventing the release of the hostages. Okay, and there's a similar one in the Telegraph, in Ynet, in Reuters, and all of the other publications as well. So the United States is threatening to blame Israel for the absence of a ceasefire, for the absence of a hostage deal, and to say that Netanyahu is responsible for the continuing plight of the hostages rather than Hamas. And how did Hamas respond to this? This stepped up U.S. pressure on Israel in the most rational way that could be expected, which is that Yahya Sinwar said that he isn't sending any negotiators to this round of discussions with Israel. Why? Because why should he? Because the United States is putting all the pressure on Israel. He has no reason to come to any agreement. He's absolutely correct. Why would he do that? Moreover, Hamas entered in this new demand, I think yesterday, August 13th, where they said, look, if Israel's really serious about a deal, then they'll stop firing now. Why should we have to wait until we agree to a ceasefire deal for Israel to stop prosecuting this war? That's showing that they're not serious about getting to a ceasefire if they're continuing to fire in the absence of a deal. So we're demanding an immediate cessation of Israeli operations in Gaza as a precondition for us even accepting a deal. Again, this is the way that you negotiate. If you see that the mediators are all on your side, and certainly Egypt and Qatar are on Hamas's side, and now we see that the Biden administration is fully on board with Hamas's negotiating pitch and is poised. In fact, it already has, really. I mean, when they say they're poised to blame Netanyahu, what they mean is that they really are. In fact, the New York Times had this big expose the other day claiming that Netanyahu has added more and more conditions to the ceasefire agreement that make it impossible to get a deal. So he's the one blocking a deal. So all of the pressure is on Israel to capitulate to all of Hamas's growing demands. And Israel responded saying, look, since Biden presented his plan in May, Hamas has increased it, has added 29 new conditions to agreeing to a ceasefire deal with the hostages, with a limited hostage release. So it's not us that's blocking a deal. It's Hamas, which of course is true, because Hamas is holding out for complete Israeli capitulation, which was its position already on October 7th after it took all of the hostages. So it has not really changed its position one iota since the outset of the war. Total Israeli cessation of hostilities, removal of all Israeli forces from Gaza. We get to keep most of the hostages forever, essentially, and the United States will side with us, and also agree to reconstruct Gaza. So they're getting all of that without agreeing to a hostage deal. So why would they agree to a hostage deal? There's absolutely no reason. The hostages are their ace in the hole. And they're not gonna give it up, especially when they're not facing any pressure to do so, and they're not facing any pressure to do so, with the United States placing all the pressure on Israel. And what the United States is doing in an insidious fashion, as it's done all along, is that it manipulates the hostages' families into believing that the culprit in their children's plight is Netanyahu and not Hamas. So it shifts the focus of the discourse from Hamas, which carried out the aggression and continues to aggress. In fact, Hamas over the weekend said that one of the Israeli male hostages had been murdered by his guards, and that two of the Israeli female hostages had been critically wounded by their guards. So what they're saying is we're beginning to execute the hostages, right? Their lives are imperiled, and they're not being blamed for it. Netanyahu is being blamed for it. By whom? By the United States of America, by the Biden administration, by the White House, right? And, of course, the vice president. who comes out every single day haranguing Israel that we need a ceasefire now when she's talking to the crowds of her progressive fans. So we're talking about a situation which is precluding any hostage deal because all of the pressure is going on the side that's been aggressed against, not on the side of the aggressor who's holding the hostages, which is what you would expect if you were having a reasonable or rational negotiating process. But that's not what we're having. What we're seeing with the hostage negotiations is of a piece with what we're seeing with the U.S. deployment. The U.S. deployment is geared towards containing Israel, and the hostage negotiations is geared towards containing Israel, blocking Israel from achieving the strategic victory that its hard-fought victories on the battlefield have earned it, right? And throw all of the achievements of our soldiers that have been achieved through such great price in terms of our dead and our wounded, right, and our economy and everything else that's going on in Israel and our society. Give it all up in order to appease Iran, And by the way, there was another report that came out last night, I think I saw it on Channel 14, that said that the United States, vis-a-vis Iran, is saying two things. And one is President Biden said yesterday, I think it was, that Iran won't have a justification for attacking Israel if we reach a ceasefire deal. In other words, it has a justification for attacking Israel if we don't reach a ceasefire deal. So the United States is actually saying that it's fine for Iran to retaliate against Israel for presumably killing a terror grandmaster, Ismail Haniyeh, when he was in Iran, the world's number one state sponsor of terrorism, including Hamas, including Hezbollah, including the Houthis, including the militia in Iraq and in Syria, et cetera, including the terrorist regime of Bashar al-Assad, including all of these things, right? So you had Ismail Haniyeh celebrating the inauguration of the new Iranian president with the Iranians, staying at a guest house of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. These are all crimes under international law because they're harboring wanted terrorists, right? But whatever, who cares? They have a right to retaliate against Israel for Israel carrying out a lawful mission of assassinating Haniyeh while he was sheltering in Iran. And to be clear, he was killed in Iran because the United States has demanded that Israel not attack anybody in their ally Qatar, where all of the Hamas's exiled leadership lives in, the lap of luxury in Doha. So you're not allowed to attack them in Qatar. You're not allowed to attack them in NATO ally Turkey, which is just a story in and of itself, and we're going to have to devote an entire In Focus to what the hell Recep Erdogan is still doing in NATO. But be that as it may, the United States blocks Israel from taking out Hamas's leadership in Qatar or in Turkey. So Israel took it out in Iran. And now the Americans are responding to this by telling the Iranians that they have legitimacy to attack Israel for carrying out this mission in Iran. All right? And if that's not enough, there was another story that came out yesterday, two more. One is that Iran is thinking of participating in the ceasefire talks itself as at least an observer. Because, let's just rub it in a little bit thicker. Let's just show, again, that what this is a gang rape of Israel. It's not a hostage deal. It's not hostage release talks. It's about everybody ganging up and demanding that Israel capitulate to the demands of Hamas, to the demands of Iran, to the demands of Hezbollah, which are supported by the U.S. government. Which is shocking, but look, what are you supposed to do? This is what they're communicating on a daily basis. We want a ceasefire at all costs, and Netanyahu is going to be blamed for blocking a ceasefire. So who are they blaming? Netanyahu. Who are they blaming? Israel. So that's what we're seeing here. All right, and we're not going to get a ceasefire because again, look at what Hamas is. Everybody forgets what Hamas is. Hamas wants peace. Hamas wants tranquility. Hamas wants to get to a deal, and it's just Netanyahu that won't let them get to a deal. No, Hamas wants to annihilate Israel and sadistically as possible murder as many of us as possible and humiliate us and terrify us and immiserate us. That's what they do. That's who they are. They are ISIS in the most profound way. And in fact, they're worse than ISIS. ISIS never killed with the same sadistic ecstasy as we saw on October 7th. Hard to say, but it's true. Hamas is worse than ISIS. And here they are treating Ismail Haniyeh. I heard Tony Blinken, the Secretary of State, he said in a recent statement, he referred to Yahya Sinwar, the mass murdering monster, as Mr. Sinwar. Mr. Sinwar. Mr. Yes, sir. No, sir. Mr. Sinwar. Right? That's who he referred to him as. Just laying aside who these people are, what they just did, what they would do more of, what they're doing to our hostages every day. Now they're bragging that they're executing them. All of the pressure should be on Hamas. In any normal set of circumstances, that's would be what happened. But that's not what the United States wants. We want to prevent a wider war, meaning we want to prevent Israel from winning this war. That's all it means. It's a euphemism for let's block Israel from winning. And this brings me to the last part that I wanted to discuss with you today. What are we seeing here in action? What is this policy that the United States is enacting? And what can we learn about that when we're trying to compare Kamala Harris administration's foreign policy to Donald Trump foreign policy? Because we know when we look at Kamala Harris's advisors, I discussed them in my latest article about Kamala Harris and Trump. When we look at her policies, when we look at her statements, we understand that not only will she continue Joe Biden's policies, which have been horrible, but she's actually going to escalate them in a more radical direction because she doesn't feel any compunction to actually be moderate, to express any moderation in her anti-Israel views, in her desire to appease, in her anti-American views of the Middle East, et cetera, et cetera. She's pure Obama, but 12 years after Obama left office. That's who she is. That's what you see, the linear advance or even the geometrical advance of Obama's anti-American policy in the Middle East. That's where we find ourselves with Kamala Harris. So Kamala Harris, her policy, which is really what's being enacted now, is it's the opposite of isolationism in the following way, that you commit very significant U.S. military assets to a theater, to the Middle East, for instance, in order not to protect your ally or stand with or support your allies or to advance America's national security. So we see Americans are being attacked. I think there were just 8 or 9 Americans that were wounded in Iraq, and the U.S. came out and said that they're going to remove all of its forces from Iraq. So it's just going to be a redux of the Afghan withdrawal and humiliation from 2019. 2021. So Kamala Harris is coming in, right? And they want to use these military assets in the Middle East to do what? It's not to protect U.S. forces. It's not to retaliate against those who attack U.S. Military forces, first and foremost Iran. It's not to do any of those things. It's to appease Iran. It's to block Israel from winning in a way that would cause Iran a strategic loss. And by the way, I just saw a report, I think this morning, that Iran is moving into weaponization of its nuclear weapons, so that it's actually moving into the weaponization phase where they have nuclear capable ballistic missiles, and they're being able to place nuclear devices that they've developed into a warhead. Okay, so they are about this far away from testing a nuclear weapon, this far, right? That's where they are, and they continue to move ahead with this. And the United States wants to appease them. What is this nuclear diplomacy that we suddenly heard about for the first time in over a year that the United States wants to re-engage with the Iranians about? Well, Iran is about to become a nuclear-armed state. What is the American response to that? Let's talk. Not, we said that you would never get a nuclear weapon. No, let's talk. And by the way, how about if we get Israel to capitulate in Gaza, in Lebanon? We have Amos Hochstein trying to force this deal down Israel's throat, which is totally linked to Hamas, right? That if Israel capitulates to Hamas, then they'll also capitulate to Lebanon, to Hezbollah. That's what the offer for Israel is. Great offer, right? And in the meantime, the United States wants to engage in nuclear appeasement of the mullahs at a time when the mullahs are a hair's breadth from a nuclear arsenal, thanks to the non-enforcement of U.S. sanctions against Iran under the Biden administration. So the Biden administration created this entire mess because they were pursuing a policy, a strategy of appeasement of Iran at the expense of Israel, Saudi Arabia, et cetera, et cetera. And this remains American policy. Shockingly, after October 7th, the United States didn't revise its policy under the Biden administration, the Biden-Harris administration. They maintained it, full speed, on course, and we're seeing it all working out now. So it's to use U.S. military assets in order to appease America's enemies by containing America's allies. And it's also about downgrading the power of America's allies in order to transform them from sovereign states into vassal states. And I'll give you just one other example of that. So this week, Reuters reported that after 3 years, the United States has ended its embargo on the sale of offensive weapons to Saudi Arabia. Why? Because, the report said, Saudi Arabia has desisted from attacking the Houthis for the past 3 years, which is the reason that the United States sanctioned Saudi Arabia and banned the sale of offensive weapon systems to the kingdom for the past 3 years. So the United States told the Saudis, you're not allowed to maintain your war to overthrow this Houthi regime, which is an Iranian proxy that is threatening world oil markets by attacking the Saudi oil installations and their shipping lanes, etc. Right? And we're going to ban you from attacking the Houthis, from trying to overthrow the regime. And we're going to do this by blocking the sale of offensive weapons to the kingdom. So they did that. The Saudis stood down. They said, what the hell, you don't work? And what did the Houthis do? They escalated their assault on global shipping, on the global oil markets, by placing an effective, by waging a missile war against shipping, maritime shipping across the Straits of Mandab, across the Bab el-Mandab, which is a choke point through which I think 30 or 40% of oil exports move on a daily basis. So you're talking about massive damage to the oil economy. The United States sanctioned Saudi Arabia for trying to combat it on its own as an American ally, rather than standing with the Saudis because it was a threat to U.S. national security as well. The United States removed the Houthis from the list of foreign terrorist organizations. It banned the Saudis from attacking the Houthis. And now that the Saudis have proven that they're not interested in continuing to maintain war against the Houthis, the United States will continue to sell them offensive weapons, but of course they're not allowed to use them against the Houthis, who in the meantime have undermined the rationale, really, for the U.S. Navy, because the U.S. Navy, since the halls of Montezuma, since their fight with the Barbary pirates, has always defined its core mission as protecting international maritime shipping lanes, right? The freedom of navigation in the seas. And here the U.S. Navy is being used to protect the Houthis from the Saudis. So, that's just one example of the neutering of an ally and the transformation of Saudi Arabia into a vassal state from a U.S. ally. And here was Mohammed bin Salman. For the first time, the Saudis were stepping up and saying, we'll take care of it ourselves. Trump said, fine, and Biden came into office and said, absolutely not. You're not going to get any weapons. We're going to put you on the terrorist list. We're going to try to overthrow the Saudi regime. We're taking the Houthis off of the list of foreign terrorist organizations and deal with it. So what we're seeing is that you have a U.S. policy of appeasement, and it's being carried out by neutering U.S. allies. That's what they're trying to do with Israel. That's what they already succeeded in doing with Saudi Arabia. Okay, that's what we're seeing. And if it goes forward, it will be the end of Israeli sovereignty, effectively. If Israel agrees to stand down, to capitulate, to allow Iran to become a nuclear armed state, and for the Biden administration to maintain this policy of we're going to defend Israel instead of Israel defending itself, even though Israel defends itself. we're going to block it from having the weapons capability that it needs in order to carry out this war to completion, to victory. We're going to wage a diplomatic war against Israel by blaming its leader for blocking a hostage deal, right? And because he's failing to capitulate completely to Hamas's demands. And we're going to try to oust him from power. We're going to destabilize his coalition. We've talked about that in the past. We're going to do all of these things because we don't want allies. We want vassals. We want vassals in furtherance of our goal of appeasing our enemies at our allies' expense. That's the Kamala Harris foreign policy. Using U.S. diplomacy and using the U.S. military in order to appease America's enemies and undermine the independence and the capabilities of American allies to defend themselves by themselves. That's the doctrine. It's crazy, but that is what we're seeing. That's what we saw under Obama. That's what we're seeing now under Biden, and that's what we're going to see much more of under a Kamala Harris presidency. And that brings us to Donald Trump. Donald Trump, had you could say that this is sort of unprecedented, the appeasement through force, right, of the Obama, Biden, Harris group. You never had a Democratic or Republican administration pursuing this kind of a foreign policy, but there you have it. That's what we've been seeing since 2009 from the Democrats. And now let's go to Trump. So Trump also had an unprecedented foreign policy. His detractors call it isolationism, and in a way it is isolationism. Trump made clear that he wants to end U.S. involvement in foreign wars, and he wanted to pull out U.S. forces from Afghanistan. He said it. He was talking to the Taliban. He was talking to Kim Jong-il or whatever, or Kim Jong-un, whatever, the Kim in North Korea. He was doing all kinds of things that seemed crazy to neoconservatives and other interventionists. And he was saying, I want to pull back U.S. forces. He wanted to pull out U.S. forces from Syria. He ended up keeping them there when he was shown that he could keep a skeletal force of U.S. forces in Syria and still they have an enormous impact on blocking the march of Russia, blocking the march of ISIS, blocking the march of Iran through Syria and beyond in the Middle East. So he kept them there when he saw their importance and their smallness, their limited force structure in Syria. But he does not want to engage in endless wars in the Middle East. But what does he want to do? He wants to empower America's allies to do the fighting themselves, so that rather than having the United States, like in the Gulf War under George H.W. Bush, assemble this Western coalition with Arab members who did nothing, right? All of the Arab League were members in this massive coalition that was amassed by George H.W. Bush, but almost all of the fighting was done by the Americans and the British. So you have these big coalitions. They include everybody gets to have their name on the list, right? And that was what U.S. interventionism after the Cold War looked like. And Trump came in and said, we don't need that. We don't need to invade Iraq time after time in 1990 and 1991, and then in 2003, and then have this massive commitment. Same with Afghanistan. What we have to do is empower America's allies to fight their own wars. The people on the ground who have the same enemies as the United States says, let's give them the political backing, the diplomatic backing, and let's give them, to the extent that they need them, the military capabilities they require in order to carry out the job. If we have to give them logistical support or whatever, fine, but we want to have a minimal American footprint in these regional wars, where we have regional allies who are capable of fighting them on their own. And it worked. It worked incredibly well. Because it brought peace, because suddenly you have these people on the ground who aren't leaving. Israel isn't leaving. Saudi isn't leaving. They're not leaving. So you empower them to stand on their own, to stand up for themselves. And Iran is deterred. You just stop doing stuff that empowers your enemies. You stop sanctions relief against Iran. You impose crippling sanctions on Iran so that they can't build up the economic wherewithal to maintain their war against all of the nations in the region that aren't their proxies, right? You do this, it's a low-cost investment, and it brings maximum returns. So on the one hand, you have you have Kamala's idea that what they need to do is appease Iran by removing the sovereign capacity of America's allies to defend themselves against the common enemies of the United States and U.S. allies. That's what we're seeing now with their efforts to block Israel, to pull defeat out of the jaws of strategic victory, or whatever the saying is, that Israel is about to accomplish against Hamas and in time against Hezbollah and Iran, to protect Iran as it crosses the nuclear finish line, the same way that they did to Saudi Arabia in 2021 with the Houthis, and to do it by denying them the means to defend themselves with the deployment of massive U.S. military assets to the region, and then proclaiming, here, we've saved you, we've defended you. Take a win. Take a win. And Donald Trump saying, win it your way, we'll stand with you, we trust you, you're our ally, we know that you're on our side. Donald Trump says that October 7th would never have happened if he were president on October 7th, and I think that he's probably right, because by standing with America's allies, whether it's through moving the embassy to Jerusalem, recognizing Israeli sovereignty in the Golan Heights, standing with Israel when we're attacked with missiles from Gaza or what have you, the United States said, look, Israel is not only capable, but is supported when it defends itself. It's supported when it defends itself. In his talk the other day on X, I didn't get a chance to hear all of it yet, but Donald Trump said very clearly, he said, Hamas is a terrorist organization, Iran is a terrorist organization, Hezbollah is a terrorist organization. Believe it or not, the Biden administration doesn't even say that very often anymore. They can't bring minimal clarity to what they're doing, because what they're doing is so ridiculous. So that's basically where we are. You have a very clear-cut choice in this election between isolationism through the empowerment of U.S. allies that minimizes the American need to actually put boots on the ground in the Middle East or, frankly, anywhere else in the world, versus appeasement through massive force projection, U.S. intervention in all kinds of arenas in all kinds of different ways, whose goal is actually to empower America's allies against the United States' own national security interests and against the sovereign interests, the existential interests of America's now spurned allies. So that's really where we are. We see it very clearly with where we stand today. I remember in the months before the Rafah invasion, we had these things, week after week, where I would just express my frustration. We're about to go into Rafah. Yeah, we haven't gone in yet. And I'd get these comments from you guys saying, when is Israel going in? When is Israel going in? And I'd want to pull my hair out in the same frustration that you were voicing in your comments, because it's ridiculous. But it was because Netanyahu was waiting out the negotiations. The Biden administration, again, was using the same thing, using the Israeli left, using the hostages' families, taking them essentially hostage for a second time, saying, look, now the dice are in your hands. You guys have to accept the hostage talks. So they place all this pressure on Netanyahu until Hamas finally rejects the deal, because Hamas is ISIS, because they don't negotiate with Jews. They kill them. They kill us. That's what their job is. That's what they're here to do. They're not here to make a deal. They're here to survive. And here the Biden administration is giving it to them on a golden platter. So why would they make why would they capitulate in any way to Israel's demands? They won't. They have no reason to. There's the same thing then. So as soon as the negotiations fell apart, Netanyahu ordered the IDF to go into Rafah. And here you see the same kind of thing. We're waiting and waiting and waiting. The United States is pulling out all the stoppers to try to block Israel from attacking preemptively Iran or Hezbollah, while begging them not to attack Israel, while saying we're going to contain it, we're going to protect Israel, we're going to block a regional war, which has been going on, of course, since October 7th. And all this in the service of appeasing Iran at the expense of Israel, Saudi Arabia, and any other, and the UAE, and forcing us to toe a line of American appeasement of our worst enemies in a way that places our very existence in jeopardy. I don't think for a second that Israel is going to accept this, even if we have a lot of people in the military general staff who think that this is a good idea for various reasons, which we'll get into in a different show. But Netanyahu didn't pledge absolute victory over and over and over again in order to have absolute capitulation after 10 months of war. I don't believe it for a minute, because he also knows that the Israeli people won't stand for it. And so here we get to another deadlock with the U.S. government. And I assume that with Harris now courting the radical left rather than moving towards the middle as we approach the Democratic National Convention and as we approach Election Day on November 5th, I don't see how this ends nicely, unfortunately. But it will end with Israeli victory, of that I am sure, by one way or another. All right, I'll talk to you guys again soon. Take care. Great to be home. And again, prayers for Jonathan Tobin, Jonathan, the son of Frida. Thanks so much, and we'll see you again soon.